There's nothing in the world quite like getting your very first job, right? That first little taste of independence. You're kind of making your own money, able to pay for your own stuff, and learning how to manage your money and making just a ton of mistakes in that realm. I'm still paying for mistakes at 36 that I made when I was 25, so it's fantastic. Life is great. But you're just kind of figuring that out. But with every first job, there must be the very first job interview. And is there anything more stressful than your first job interview? Is there anything that can cause a teenage kid more anxiety than trying to figure out that first interview? When I was 16, I decided to get my first real job. I'd worked a couple of years here and there, just kind of doing some stuff. I worked at the Indiana State Fair, but that job was really seasonal. I don't know if you know that about the State Fair. It doesn't go all year. Who knew? I think today's actually the last day for the State Fair, so head on down there and go get yourself a turkey leg. But I worked there as a money collector on the shuttles, those little tractors that take you around. That was a fine job. And then I also worked here and there for a small business that was owned by a friend of my mom's. And when I say small business, I mean real small. It was about the size of most broom closets. And the only people working there were him and me. Doesn't get a whole lot smaller than that. But when I was 16, I decided that it was time for my first real job. Okay, full transparency. My dad decided that it was time for me to get my first real job and get out of the house. And so I applied to go be a combination of cart and bag boy at the Meijer here in Kokomo. And I remember getting ready for my first job interview, being there and all that stuff. I was wearing a tie that was a little too big for me, and I had tied it myself, and it wasn't straight or anything like that, and it probably wasn't tied correctly because I was just winging it. I don't like ties. I should say that. I have a thing about things being around my neck. I don't like it. And especially now, it distracts from the beard. So I don't like wearing ties, but I thought this is my first job interview. I want to make a really good first impression, so I should probably go ahead and wear the tie. But I remember being really just sweaty. My hands were really, really clammy, and there was a severe fear that I was going to pass out before I ever walked into this interview. I was waiting outside the offices at Meijer, and if you've ever been in Meijer, the offices are somewhere between what is now the electronics repair store and Sandy the penny pony. There's a little tiny hole right there, and those are where the offices are. I didn't know that until I went for this interview. It was exciting. But I was waiting outside there just trying to rack my brain, trying to figure out what are they going to ask me, what am I going to do, how am I going to answer certain things. And then finally the manager came out, and he shook my hand, and I could tell by the expression on his face that my hand was a little too sweaty and clammy. And I think after I walked in the room, I could see him kind of doing this number. We're off to a really great start at this interview. I felt great. Now, he went through kind of the usual interview questions that you get. At almost every job interview asks you these same questions. And while I don't remember what my answers were that particular day, I do know what my answers would be now for going for a job as a combination cart and bag boy at 16 years old. He asked me the simple questions of, where do I see myself in 5 years? Hopefully not in this interview anymore. That would have been my answer. Why do you think you want this job? I want money. Right? That's a simple answer to give that. What special gifts do you have that make you think you're qualified to be our cart boy and bag boy? Well, I can push carts, and I can put things in bags, like a champ. So you should hire me for that. And then he asked me, is there anything else I should know? And I know what he's asking for now. Like he was asking, is there anything about my past, or do I have a criminal record, or things like that? But I really, really wish I could go back in time and say, maybe reevaluate the questions you're asking a 16-year-old for an entry-level job, because you're making it sound like I'm going after a career, and I think we both know I'm not going to be a cart boy when I'm 60. That'd be kind of fun, right? Anybody want to be a cart boy now? Hey, by the way, while we're on the subject, you push the cart for 2 miles around the store, take it to the cart corral. They're all at most 40 yards away. It's not going to hurt. Don't leave them in the parking lot. Don't be that guy. Or gal, whichever the case may be. Anyway, But one question that he asked me that I know for a fact I had a really difficult time answering, one question that he asked me that stopped me in my tracks and for the first time possibly in my life got me to stop talking, he asked me the question, what are your weaknesses? Now, I was under the impression that when we started this interview that this whole interview was about why I'm awesome and why you should hire me. I thought that was the only thing that we were trying to accomplish in the midst of this conversation, that you should hire me based on my awesomeness. So when he asked me what are my weaknesses, I wasn't ready to answer that question. Now, it's not because even at 16 years old I couldn't identify what my weaknesses are. I was still self-aware enough to know that I have some weaknesses, but I didn't want to say them out loud. I didn't want to point them out to this person who I barely knew. It could have been anybody else in my life. It could have been my best friend, and I still don't want to point out what my weaknesses are. I think all of us, we have this defensive mechanism about ourselves that we try to hide our weaknesses. We're all very well aware of the ways that we fall short as human beings, are we not? Cool, just me. But we all have these weaknesses in our lives, but we are so conditioned and so trained to hide these things. We do everything that we can to make ourselves look good and seem amazing, even so much so to the point that we've developed answers to this question of what are our weaknesses that don't sound like weaknesses. We say things like, well, I work too hard and I care too much. Right? Nobody ever works too hard or cares too much. I don't care what your job is. There are days you're slacking off. Let's be real. But we have this thing about ourselves. We've been conditioned most of our lives to project a certain image of ourselves to the world. And universally, that image that we try to project is, I'm great, I'm awesome, I'm the best, I'm amazing. Right? We do everything we can to shield our weaknesses from the rest of the world. We don't want people to see the ways that we fall short, to see the ways that we are not good enough, to see the ways that we don't measure up to whatever standard it is that we've set for ourselves. We think of ourselves most of the time as pretty great. We want others to think that we're pretty great as well. We're really good at playing the comparison game of, well, I'm not really great here, but I'm still better than that guy. I don't quite know how to do this, but I know a little bit more than they do. We have an issue with pride. Every single person who's ever walked God's green earth has an issue with pride. And here's the thing, whether you're a Christian or not, we know that pride is wrong. We know that pride is something that we should not have. We don't like to be around other people who are trying to convince us or prove to us that they're the best at anything. We don't like to be around people who talk constantly about themselves or brag about what they've got or brag about what they've done or tell us ad nauseum about subjects that we don't care about. We don't like to be around those types of people. We know that humility is an important thing for us, but our actions are generally self-focused. They're self-motivated, they're self-glorifying, they're self-elevating. We know we should be more humble, but our default setting seems to be stuck on pride. We want the spotlight to be on us. We want everyone around us to think that we're great. And if we're honest with ourselves, we want to be the one that other people are annoyed by our success. We want to be that person who can just make everybody else quietly roll their eyes because we're so great. And because of this sense of self-elevation, because of the sense that we need to highlight our strengths and shy away from our weaknesses and be in that spotlight, we reach a point of tension. When Jesus tells us in Matthew 5, verse 5, that blessed are the humble. Again, we know the value of humility. We know that it's important for us to strive to be more humble in our lives, but it's hard to consider somebody who's humble as being blessed. So far, we're now on our third beatitude, our third blessed are, and so far 3 for 3. We're wondering if Jesus really knows what it means to be blessed. If you recall, a couple of weeks ago, we said that we have a tendency to equate blessing with abundance. And the only way that it seems like we're ever going to achieve abundance in our lives is by focusing on ourselves. elevating ourselves, pushing ourselves to be the best, to get that spotlight to be on us almost by force. So this conflict of what we equate as a blessing and what Jesus says is actually a blessing, it creates an inner struggle. It makes us feel like it's impossible for us to overcome that. Probably the biggest reason why this one in particular is difficult for us to wrap our minds around is based on how we ultimately view humility. See, this one doesn't make us irritated or frustrated like the idea that we're blessed in our brokenness like we were a couple of weeks ago. This one doesn't even make us angry like we were last week when Jesus told us that we're blessed when we mourn. This notion of the humble being blessed, this notion that blessing comes from our being humble in the midst of everything else in a culture that screams at us that we need to put number one first. This idea that humbleness is equal to blessing, it makes us uncomfortable. It makes us squirm because it challenges a mindset that we've had our entire lives, a mindset that whether anybody has vocally said it to us or not, every single one of us wrestles with. We don't want to be humble. We want to be the person that the spotlight is shined upon. We don't want to humble ourselves to serve the people around us. We want to be the person who everybody is tripping over themselves to serve. We equate this notion of blessing and humility as being uncomfortable because it challenges a deep, deep-rooted mindset in us. If we're really honest and if we really take a look at ourselves inward, we would probably say the reason why we find this notion of blessing coming from humility, why we find this uncomfortable, is because in all reality, we tend to view humility and people who are humble as a weakness. We view people who are naturally humble, people who are not really striving for that spotlight, we view them almost as doormats. People that we step on our way to the top, people who are just willingly letting other people get ahead of them in life. So we view humility as weakness. And so when Jesus tells us that humility is a blessing, that's a hard thing for us to wrap our minds around. We struggle with this notion. We want to prove our superiority in every single way, and so we view humility as weakness. But ultimately, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, I would say it takes a great amount of strength for us to be humble. It takes effort, it takes energy, it takes a focus to strive for humility in our life because, again, our natural default setting is me. I'm number one, I'm the best. I want to be in the spotlight. It takes an intense amount of pride. It is a conscious choice we have to make to be humble. And it is a choice that Jesus, the Son of God, the Emmanuel, God made flesh, a choice that he made over and over and over and over again. If anybody had any right to be the most prideful being on God's green earth, it was Jesus. And yet constantly, he chose to be humble. There are dozens, if not hundreds of examples in the gospel that we could give to prove this particular point. But there is no example that is more powerful, no example that is more poignant, no image that is more lasting than we find in our text today in John chapter 13, verses 1 through 17. This is a story that I am certain, at least vaguely familiar with. If not, you know it by heart. It is something that many in this room have probably heard sermons written about 10,000, 100,000 different times in your life. I know of at least one or two that you've likely heard from me. Because it's a text that we're so familiar with, we're so ingrained with. It's an image of Jesus that we all know so very well. But there's a part of this particular text that we oftentimes overlook. At most, it becomes kind of just a footnote that we say in passing as we move on to something else in our discussion of this text. And yet, that portion that we have a tendency to overlook, that portion that we have a tendency to blow right past, it is likely the most important part of the entire narrative that we read in John chapter 13, verses 1 through 17. Again, Jesus and his disciples here, as we get to this point, are preparing for the Passover. It is a big deal in the Jewish customs and Jewish faith. This is a representation of when the angel of death passed over the Israelites back in Egypt, sparing them from the sacrifice of the firstborn. Or not sacrifice, but the death of the firstborn plague. It marked the end of their time in Egypt because it was the final plague that allowed for Pharaoh to finally say, "Get out of here." It was what ultimately led them towards freedom, towards the promised land that God had promised all the way back to Abraham. And so every year, this particular holiday was a massive deal for the Israelite people, and Jesus and his disciples are preparing to celebrate together. They've done it already for the last couple of years, but what they don't know, or at least what the disciples are unaware of, is that this is going to be the last time. In fact, this is going to be the last meal that they sit down together this side of the cross. Jesus and his disciples get in there, and as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, it was customary for especially important meals like this one for there to be a servant present whose whole responsibility was to wash the feet of the people there. Again, we mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, but people walked everywhere in Jesus' time. They either walked, if you had money, you could get an animal, but that was very rare, and yet animals would roam the streets, the dirt streets. And their shoes aren't exactly the shoes that we have today. They had very paper-thin leather sandals. So if you're walking everywhere, in the dirt and in the mud, and you're stepping into some things that the animal before you left behind, nobody wants to wash your feet. Right? You probably don't want to wash your own feet. It's that disgusting of a job. It was the job that was reserved for the lowest of all the servants in the household. If there was a new servant that was there, guess what his job is? Welcome to the house. It was something that was gross, it was disgusting, and yet when they arrived for this dinner, verses 4 through 5, tell us who did this degrading and disgusting job that nobody would volunteer for. It says, so he being Jesus, got up from supper, laid aside his outer clothing, took a towel, tied it around himself. Next he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and dry them with the towel he tied around himself. Once more, we're so familiar with this particular narrative, this particular story, that it's so easy for us to just kind of blow right past this idea, right? Because we know what's coming up next, we know what's going to happen. But for the disciples in that room that night, this was a shocking development. This was something that none of them expected was going to have. To see Jesus, their teacher, their master, the one who's the most important guy in that room, the one who most, if not all of them, have already made the discovery that he is the Messiah, the chosen one of God, the one who would come and set things right. For him to tie a towel around his waist, to wash their feet, their dirty and disgusting feet, this was utterly and completely unthinkable for them. If you'll note, none of them volunteered to do it. See, I'm guessing when they walked in the room, they all recognized, hey, there's nobody here to wash our feet. Hey, when's the kid coming around to do this? None of them were the ones jumping up to go and take care of this. It was a gross and disgusting and degrading thing to have happen. It was not something that you'd ever expect Jesus to do. We don't think of it this way. I mean, even now some of us are still a little weirded out by feet, but the notion of washing somebody else's feet, it's not the most comfortable thing in our minds, but it's also not the worst thing we could ever think of. But if you were a first century Christian, if you were somebody who just learned about this Jesus and the disciples are telling you this story, you're going to have a visceral reaction to this. The notion that the Messiah, the Son of God, would wash the feet of those who are lower than him is unthinkable, it's just disgusting. You don't want to think about that sort of thing. Peter was so overcome by the shock of what Jesus was doing that at first he refused to participate, telling Jesus in the first part of verse 7, you will never wash my feet. Even Peter recognized how terrible this was. It is a big deal that Jesus did this. Understand, he did not have to. He did not have to do this. In fact, given the role that he played in this group's dynamic, Jesus would have been well within his power and authority to say, hey, Pete, wash everybody's feet. Now, I'm willing to bet that had he have done that, Peter probably would have reacted with the same enthusiasm my children do when I tell them to go clean their room. Stomp off. At best, he could say, good one, Jesus. I don't want to do that. But if Jesus would have done that, he'd have been well within his authority to make that happen. To say that any one of them should be the one to get up and do that sort of thing. It would likely have been met, again, with that same just terrible attitude. They don't want to do this sort of thing. And yet, Jesus in this moment made a choice. Made a conscious decision to humble himself. He did so through this incredible act of service. He made the choice to put service to his disciples above his own position and above his own authority. But when Jesus finished washing the last of their feet, when he got rid of the water, when he got rid of the towel, he put his outer cloak back on and he quietly took his seat again. Every single person in that room has got their eyes completely fixated on him, watching everything that he's doing. They're staring at him slack-jawed. You could hear a pin drop in this room as they waited in silence for what Jesus would say next. I like to picture it that after Jesus got himself settled, he just kind of quietly scanned the room, making eye contact with each and every disciple, them just incredulous to knowing why he did this thing, why he would wash the feet of everyone in this room, including the man who in just a few hours would betray him. They had not completely processed what had just happened, and then Jesus softly cleared his throat, ready to explain why he had done what he had done, why he stooped to such a low position. And what he said again is something that we oftentimes read, but we rarely examine. It's something that we pass over, but we rarely take to heart. Jesus says in verses 12 and 13, "Do you know what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are speaking rightly, since that is what I am." It's important that as Jesus begins this discussion with them, he reminds them of who he is, to remind them that this is my position that I hold over you. It's not a matter of him being arrogant and trying to thrust his power upon them or make them stand in awe and wonder of him. It's simply him reminding them of their dynamic. That in this relationship, Jesus is the master, he is the teacher. You are the one who's supposed to be the servant. You're the one who's supposed to be the disciple, the one who's chasing after me, not the other way around. And then in verse 14, he hits him with a point. He says, "So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet." Jesus has just shown them that as their Lord and their teacher, if he is willing to humble himself, if he's willing to set aside his position, if he's willing to set aside his own pride, then so must they. That they must be willing to serve, even going so far as to doing such a degrading act of service, something that no one else in the room wants to do. Jesus tells them that if I, your teacher, am willing to serve you and be humble in this way, then you need to be willing to go even further. You need to be willing to do this just as much. You need to be willing to serve the people around you even as more. They need to be willing to serve each other, to serve the world around them. He says in verse 15, "For I have given you an example that you should do just as I have done for you." See, this wasn't the only time that Jesus had ever given his disciples an example of what humility looks like. It wasn't the only time that Jesus had ever put other people's needs above his own desires. We've seen him all the time going to this point where he just wants to get away, to just kind of get some rest, to get some peace, and the crowd comes and follows after him. And even though he wants to rest, and even though he'd be well within his right to say, hey guys, I need a self-care day, he doesn't do that. He puts the needs of others above his own wants and desires in his life. And his point that he's made over and over again to his disciples is that if I'm willing to go this far, if I'm willing to be this humble, if I'm willing to serve to this extent, then you need to as well. See, Jesus didn't just do these things out of the goodness of his heart. Yes, that is a huge portion of it. We can't miss that Jesus did everything that he did out of love for the people around him, but he also did it to set the example. To say that if you want to follow after me, if you want to be my disciple, this is what it looks like. It's not glamorous. It's not classy. It's not going to put the spotlight on you. But this is what is necessary. This is what he lived. Humility through service. And it never mattered if they were family or an outsider, if they were a friend or a stranger, Jesus served in humility. Period. And in this dirty, gross, terrible, disgusting act of service, Jesus shows them to what extent they're expected to go in service and humility, because this is what humility looks like. It looks like a king stooping down to wash the feet of people who don't deserve it. It looks like the King of Kings serving the worst of sinners. It looks like the Son of God taking care of people's needs. He wraps the whole thing up in verse 17 by saying, if you know these things, you're blessed if you do them. Whenever we read this narrative, or frankly any of the other hundreds of acts of service that Jesus did, it's so easy for us to get caught up in the action itself. It's so easy for us to just focus solely on the notion that Jesus washed their feet. It's so easy for us to get caught up on the notion that Jesus did these incredible acts that we've seen all throughout the Gospels, that we miss the point of why. It wasn't just to help the person out. Yes, that was his primary motivation. The people were taken care of. But he also did it to set an example as to what his followers are to look like. To what we, as the people who take the name Christian, who take that title, what we are supposed to look like. Most of the time we barely mention what Jesus said after washing their feet, even though, again, it's the most important part of the narrative. Because Jesus didn't do these things and this stuff beforehand. He didn't wash the feet of the disciples just because he was a good guy. He was willing to humble himself to serve others, to improve their lives. But also he did these things to show us what we should be doing as well. So we got to ask the inevitable question. Why aren't we? Why aren't we in humility looking to serve the people around us? Why aren't we in this moment tripping over each other trying to wash one another's feet? Why aren't we looking at service like it's something to be joyful in? The answer is really simple. It's our pride. We still fight that little voice in the back of our head that tells us that we should be the one that people are striving to serve, not the one who is serving. The pride that whispers that we're better than degrading ourselves that way. The pride that still tells us humility is a weakness. But Jesus showed us, especially in this act of service, that humility is not weakness. He showed us humility is a choice. It's a difficult choice to be sure, but it's a choice nonetheless. See, humility is a decision that we have to make to consider others and their needs as more important than ourselves and our wants. Humility is choosing to serve others over our own status. It's choosing others over ego. It's shirking the spotlight in service in secret. Jesus showed us humility by showing us our need to be in service to others around us. Because nothing in the world keeps your pride in check. Nothing in the world teaches us humility like serving those around us. By doing things, not so that we can garner more spotlight, not so we can say what a great guy we are or what a great gal we are, but to serve others because that's what Jesus did. Because we want to seek to love them in the way that Jesus loved them. Jesus taught us that service is one of the most humble things that we can do. It keeps that pride in check. So this week, today, find a way to serve. Find someone in your life who needs a little encouragement, who needs you to wash their proverbial feet. It's a hard choice to make. That pride is always going to be gnawing at the back of your head, telling you this is dumb, you shouldn't be doing this. And that's what makes humility such a strength. Because it's a choice. Find ways to serve those around you, big or small. But when we serve those around us, we aren't just learning humility, we're becoming more like Jesus, who told us, "Blessed are the humble, for they will inherit the earth."